Hi guys, welcome back. In the last session, we started our discussion related to Kubernetes. What is Kubernetes and why we need to go for Kubernetes and what is the architecture of the Kubernetes that we discussed. Kubernetes is an open source orchestration platform. It is used to manage our containers. This Kubernetes is developed using Go language. You don't need to learn the Go language to work with the Kubernetes, but the software is developed using this language. Go language is a Google product, Google language. Google developed this Go language. Using this Go language, they developed Kubernetes. This Kubernetes is free and open source. So here, Kubernetes will use Docker containers to execute our application. Kubernetes will use Docker. Internally, using Kubernetes, we will manage our Docker containers. Remember, Kubernetes is not replacement for the Docker. Kubernetes is replacement for the Docker Swarm. In the Docker Swarm, we don't have auto scaling, whereas in the Kubernetes, auto scaling is available. When we are running our application in the production, then Kubernetes is highly recommended. Kubernetes replacement for Docker Swarm. Now here in the Kubernetes, the main advantage is auto scaling, that is increasing and decreasing the containers count based on the incoming request for our application. Here Kubernetes will run in the cluster mode. What is the meaning of a cluster? As we discussed yesterday, cluster nothing but group of servers will be available, master node will be available, worker nodes will be available. Now, we will send the request to the master node to run our application. Master node will manage the worker nodes. Master node will schedule the task to the worker nodes. Now in the Kubernetes, master node is called as a control plane. We will send the request to the control plane. Control plane will assign the task to the worker node. So here, as we are having the cluster, we can achieve high availability for our application. In the Kubernetes architecture, if we see, control plane is available. Control plane is nothing but master node in the Kubernetes cluster. Inside this control plane, we are having the API server, we are having the scheduler, controller manager, and etcd. API server, scheduler, controller manager, etcd. What is the responsibility of the API server? As discussed yesterday, API server is responsible to handle incoming request of the control plane. So now, as a DevOps engineer, I want to deploy my application in the Kubernetes cluster. Now I will send a request to the control plane. Then in the control plane, API server will receive that request. Then API server will store the request data in the etcd. etcd is an internal database in the Kubernetes cluster. API server will store requests or tasks info in the etcd. Once the tasks are stored in the etcd, scheduler will come into picture. Scheduler will identify what are the pending tasks available in the etcd. Then that scheduler will talk to the nodes by using kubelet. Right here, how many nodes are available? All the nodes will be connected to our controller manager. Connected to controller manager. In every node, kubelet will be available. Now, here our control plane will connect to the node by using kubelet and it will get the node information. In which node our application should be deployed will be identified by scheduler. Then scheduler will schedule the pod creation in that particular node. Then controller manager is going to control all the task related operations. Right. So once it is done, how we can send the request to the control plane? To send the request to the control plane, we need to use kubectl software or we can use user interface. So if we want to go with the UI, then Kubernetes provided a web dashboard concept. By using that web dashboard, we can deploy our application on the Kubernetes, and we can use CLI software also, that is called kubectl. Using kubectl also we can communicate with the control plane. So here, what is a kubeproxy? Kubeproxy will provide cluster communication network. So now control plane should communicate with the worker nodes. Worker nodes should communicate with the control plane. That network cluster communication will be taken care by queue proxy. And as our application should be deployed on the node container, to run our containers, Docker engine is required. So in the worker nodes, Docker engine will be available. And the next one, how our as a pod. So what is a pod? Pod is the smallest building block that we can run in the Kubernetes cluster. So if you want to run your application will be deployed as a pod in the Kubernetes cluster. In the Docker, container is everything. In the Kubernetes, pod is everything. So when you want to deploy your application on the Kubernetes, your application will be deployed as a pod in the Kubernetes cluster. Are you guys clear? What is a control plane? What is worker node? What is API server? What is a scheduler, controller manager, etcd, kubelet, kube proxy, Docker engine, and a pod. So in the Kubernetes, our application will be deployed as a pod. What is a pod? Pod is a smallest building block that we can execute in the Kubernetes cluster. Our Docker containers will run inside the pod in the Kubernetes. So whatever the application that you want to run, that application will execute as a Docker container. That a Docker container will be executed inside the pod. So now if I want to increase the containers, I need to scale the pods. If I want to decrease the containers, I need to scale down the pods. In the Kubernetes, everything will be represented as a pod only. Now I want to deploy my Spring Boot application. For that, I need to create a pod. I need to tell to the control plane to create the pod. I can tell to control plane to create the pod either by using user interface or by using kubectl. I want to tell to Kubernetes to scale up the pods. Currently, one pod is running. I want to run 5 pods for my application. I will send that request to control plane. Increase my application pods from 1 to 5. Then Kubernetes control plane will receive my request, will increase the pod counts to 5. Okay, guys, I will tell to Kubernetes to decrease my pod count or increase my pod count. Like this, in the Kubernetes, everything will be represented as pods. Pod is a smallest building block that we can execute in our application. In the Kubernetes cluster, basically. Are you guys clear with the architecture of the Kubernetes? Are you guys clear with the architecture of the Kubernetes? Yes. Now, how to set up Kubernetes cluster? Guys, here, Kubernetes cluster, we can set up in multiple ways. Kubernetes cluster, we can set up in multiple ways. The Kubernetes cluster setup, we can divide into 2 types. One is self-managed cluster and second one is managed Kubernetes cluster. One is self-managed Kubernetes cluster and the second one is managed Kubernetes cluster. Okay, what is the meaning of self-managed Kubernetes cluster? Self-managed Kubernetes cluster means we will take a Linux machine. In that Linux machine, we can install all the required softwares. We can take one Linux machine. In that Linux machine, we can install all the required softwares. That is called as self-managed cluster. In that self-managed cluster, again, we have 2 types of clusters. One is Minikube, another one is Kubedium. Minikube is nothing but single node cluster. What is the meaning of single node cluster? Control plane, worker nodes, this kind of architecture will not be available. In one machine only, control plane will run and worker node also will run. That is a single, only one node will be available. In that node, everything will be there. That is called single node cluster. Kubedium means we can set up this cluster by taking 3 machines. One machine I will take to install the control plane. 2 machines I will take to set up the worker nodes. Like this, we can have self-managed cluster also here. Self-managed cluster means setting up the cluster on our own. Taking a Linux machine, installing all the required softwares is called as self-managed cluster. Taking a Linux machine and installing all the required softwares is called as self-managed cluster. In how many ways we can do that self-managed cluster? Self-managed cluster we can do in two ways. One is by using Minikube. Second one is by using Kubedium. Okay. Minikube is nothing but single node cluster. Kubedium is nothing but multi-node cluster. Single node cluster nothing but, so as we have seen in the architecture, control plane will be available and worker nodes will be available. But if you go for Minikube, you cannot see this architecture. Everything will be available in one machine. Okay. Now, do you think that people will use Minikube for real projects? Do you think that people will use Minikube for the real projects? No. Minikube is for beginners. The people who want to learn the Kubernetes concepts. Anybody who want to practice Kubernetes, anybody who want to learn the Kubernetes, those people will go for Minikube, a single node cluster, and they will practice the Kubernetes concepts. Here, in the real time, in the project's development, we are not going to use the Minikube. Minikube is just for practice purpose. If you want to practice Kubernetes concepts, then only we will go for Minikube, single node cluster. Okay. So apart from the Minikube, there is a concept called Kubedium. Kubedium is nothing but a multi-node cluster. Multi-node cluster nothing but we will take multiple machines in the AWS. In one machine, we will install the control plane. In other machines, we are going to set up as worker nodes. Worker nodes we need to join with the master node. So this is the cluster that we can set up by using Kubedium. But Kubedium cluster setup is difficult setup. It is going to take a lot of time, and for beginners, it is difficult to set up that Kubedium cluster. Okay, fine. In the real time, we don't use Kubedium, also very rare, because Kubernetes cluster setup is very important. If any problem occurs in the cluster setup, if any crash happened for the cluster, then our whole application will be down. So that's why in the real projects, people will go for managed Kubernetes cluster. What is the meaning of managed Kubernetes cluster? We will take the ready-made cluster from the cloud provider. That is called AWS EKS cluster. Managed Kubernetes cluster will be available. That is called AWS EKS cluster. If you go for AWS cloud, AWS is providing one ready-made cluster for you. AWS will provide you control plane. AWS will provide you control plane. If you are using AWS cloud in the project, then you can go for AWS EKS cluster. If you are going for Azure cloud, for running the Kubernetes cluster in the Azure people provided AKS cluster. If you go for Google cloud, Google people provided Google Kubernetes engine, GKE cluster. If you go for IBM cloud, IBM Kubernetes engine, they provided. Like this, every cloud provider has given ready-made Kubernetes cluster, because Kubernetes cluster is very important. And here, always we need to have high availability for the Kubernetes cluster. High availability means at any point of time, my cluster should be available. Cluster should not be down. So if you set up your own cluster, there is a chance of getting the crashes. There is a chance of cluster setup will be down. So that's why we will go for trusted solution. What is the trust solution here? If you go for AWS EKS cluster, 100% your cluster will be high available. That means Kubernetes EKS cluster will not go down. That is already proven in the AWS. From years, people are using EKS cluster in the AWS cloud for the production application deployments, right? So here there are two ways to do the Kubernetes cluster setup. One is self-managed Kubernetes cluster, and the second one is managed Kubernetes cluster. In the self-managed Kubernetes cluster, we have two options. One is called Kubedium and the second one is called Minikube. In the Kubedium, we have multi-node cluster. In the Minikube, we have single node cluster. If you go for managed Kubernetes cluster, AWS EKS is available, Azure AKS available, GCP GKE is available, IBM IKE is also available. So like this, there are several ways available. As discussed, Minikube is nothing but single node cluster that is just for beginners for practice purpose. That's it. In the real time, we don't use that cluster. Kubedium, so the company who is not using AWS cloud, the company who is not using AWS cloud, those people will go for Kubedium cluster, multi-node cluster. That means they are not using AWS cloud in the project. They are using on-premises infrastructure. Then those people which should go for Kubedium cluster. Kubedium cluster, nothing but they need to set up Kubernetes cluster, control plane, worker nodes, kubelet, kube proxy, everything they have to take care by installing lot of commands. If a company is using AWS cloud, then they will go for AWS EKS cluster. AWS EKS is the most trusted, stable Kubernetes cluster that we can use. When we go for AWS EKS, control plane will never go down. That is the guarantee given by the AWS. Are you guys clear with my point? What is a Kubernetes? Kubernetes architecture and how many ways we can set up Kubernetes cluster? How many ways we can set up Kubernetes cluster? Two ways. What are the two ways to set up the Kubernetes cluster? One is self-managed cluster. Another one is the managed Kubernetes cluster. What is the self-managed Kubernetes cluster? Creating our own cluster. That means take the Linux machine, install all the required softwares to run the Kubernetes. That is called self-managed. In the self-managed, again, two things. One is the Minikube, another one is Kubedium. What is the difference between Minikube and Kubedium? What is the difference between Minikube and Kubedium? Guys, come on. Minikube is a single node cluster. Kubedium is a multi-node cluster. When to go for Minikube? When to go for Kubedium? When to go for Minikube and when to go for Kubedium? Minikube is for learning the Kubernetes concepts and the Kubedium is for the projects deployment. Minikube and Kubedium. But in the real time, companies will use which cluster? In the real time, companies will use which cluster? Managed cluster. That nothing but provider will give the cluster for us. Providers will give the cluster for us. Provider will give the cluster for us. So if we are using AWS cloud, then we will go for AWS EKS cluster. If we are using Azure cloud, then we will go for Azure AKS cluster. If we are going for Google cloud, GCP cluster. If we are going for IBM, IKE cluster. Got it. Now guys, here, if you want to set up that Kubernetes, Kubedium, if you want to set up the Kubernetes, Kubedium, now lot of commands we need to execute. See here, Kubernetes multi-node cluster with the Kubedium. So these are the commands that we have: master and worker node common commands execution. You need to create one master node. You need to create two worker nodes. As of now, we used AWS T2 micro instances, which are free of cost. With micro instances, we will get only 1 GB RAM. With 1 GB RAM, we cannot set up the Kubernetes cluster. We need minimum 4 GB RAM in the machine. For that, T2 medium instances we need to take. T2 medium instances are commercial instances. Okay. After taking 3 virtual machines in the AWS cloud, so these commands we need to execute in all the 3 machines. These commands we need to execute in all the 3 machines for the KubeADM setup. These commands we need to execute in all the machines for the KubeADM setup. Okay. After executing all these 3 commands, then we need to execute the KubeADM in the master node. So these commands we need to execute in the master node. These commands we need to execute in the master node. So this Kubernetes KubeADM cluster setup is difficult to process with the multi-node cluster KubeADM. Okay. Even if you go for the KubeADM, you need to take 3 machines. 1 machine you need to take as a master node. 2 machines you need to take as a worker nodes. So these master node machines and worker node machines, 1 GB machines are not sufficient. We need to go for minimum 4 GB machines. So T2 medium. Here, guys, Kubernetes is free. Kubernetes is free, as we discussed. Kubernetes is an open source orchestration platform free of software. But to run the Kubernetes, some hardware requirement is available. We need to go for a minimum medium instances or large instances. If you create the large instance in the AWS, then AWS will do the charge. AWS will do the charge. So in the AWS cloud, if you see the AWS cloud, in the AWS cloud, we are going to create the Linux virtual machine. When we create Linux virtual machine in the AWS cloud, it will give you options what type of instance you want to create. What type of instance you want to create. If you go for T2 micro instance in the AWS cloud, then that is free. T2 micro is free. You don't need to pay the money for the first 1 year if you are using T2 micro. But the problem with the T2 micro, it will give you only 1 GB RAM. With the 1 GB RAM, we cannot run our Kubernetes cluster. Now go to the instance. When I go for launch instance, here, there is an option to select the images, right? So now I can select the image here, Amazon Linux, or I can select the Ubuntu. When I go for this Ubuntu here, T2 micro is coming. T2 micro free tier eligible. That is free of cost. When you go to this T2 micro, 1 GB RAM only we are getting. Free, but 1 GB RAM. Now I need to go for a minimum T2 medium. If I go for T2 medium instance, it is not free of cost. It is giving you 4 GB RAM. Hourly bill will be generated. How much bill will be generated per hour? $0.04. So very less. 2 virtual CPUs will be available for this machine and 4 GB RAM will be available. So AWS will charge amount for the T2 medium instances. In those medium instances, we can install the Kubernetes. Kubernetes is free, but these Linux machines are costly. So we need to take 3 T2 medium instances and we need to set up Kubernetes KubeADM cluster. So as you guys are beginners, this setup is difficult, guys. So people in the previous batches also we have done the setup. People are doing a lot of mistakes with the Kubernetes cluster setup because so these commands we need to execute very carefully. So that's why currently I'm not going with the KubeADM cluster. I'm going with the EKS cluster. I will go with the AWS EKS cluster. So AWS EKS cluster is nothing but managed Kubernetes cluster. AWS EKS cluster is nothing but managed Kubernetes cluster. So here I will go for AWS EKS cluster. Is it free? No. AWS people are managing the Kubernetes cluster for us. They will do the charge. They will do the charge. So AWS EKS cluster is a commercial, the most trusted, robust cluster that we are going to work, right? That cluster AWS is providing. So you can go with either KubeADM cluster or you can go with AWS EKS cluster. If you go with the KubeADM cluster, you need to take the Linux machines and you need to install the cluster on your own. So that will take a lot of time and lot of commands we need to execute. So I will explain in the upcoming classes how to set up the KubeADM cluster also. Because in some projects, if cloud is not available, then we need to set up the KubeADM cluster. If the cloud is available in the project, then definitely they will use EKS cluster. In my project also, we are using AWS EKS cluster. 90%, 95% of the projects will go with the EKS cluster. Why EKS cluster? High availability will be available. Always your cluster will be up and running because we are not managing that. AWS will manage our cluster. AWS will guarantee 100% high availability for the EKS cluster. EKS is one of the most powerful solution that is providing by the AWS to run our Kubernetes applications. But AWS EKS cluster is not free of cost, guys. AWS EKS cluster is also chargeable. You can set up the EKS cluster in the AWS easily, but AWS will do charges for the EKS cluster. Hourly charges will be available. Now, here we need to use this EKS cluster for next 10 days. We need to work on the Kubernetes concepts for the next 10 days. As we are going to run the EKS cluster for the next 10 days, approximately 3,000 to 4,000 bill will be generated. As we are going to run EKS cluster in the AWS cloud, approximately 3,000 to 4,000 rupees bill amount will be generated by AWS for running the EKS cluster. So you no need to worry. You no need to pay that 3,000, 4,000 to the AWS. So in the AWS, there is an option called support center option is available. If you go for the AWS cloud, there is an option called support center option is available. Once the bill is generated, so if we are using AWS cluster, we are using EKS cluster in this month, right? So we are setting up the EKS cluster. This month bill will be generated for the next month. Okay. In the next month, our bill will be generated. Once the bill is generated in the AWS, right? First time, we are going to get around 3,000 to 4,000 bill for running the EKS cluster. You no need to pay that bill amount because AWS people will encourage students to learn the new concepts. In the AWS, there is an option called support center. You can go to the support center. You can go to the support center and you can raise a ticket, create a case. You can create a case, account billing, and you can select a billing concept here and select the category account billing, right? Something like this, you can select the billing and you can go to the step. You can mention that I'm a student. I'm practicing the AWS cloud concepts. I'm practicing AWS cloud concepts. Bill got generated. As I'm a student, I cannot pay this bill amount. Could you please make my bill amount as 0? Then AWS cloud team, support team will connect with you and they will ask you to delete all the AWS resources you are using and they will make your bill as 0. You no need to pay that amount. Are you guys getting my point? We are going to do AWS EKS cluster. EKS cluster is free of cost or EKS cluster is commercial? If you go for Kubernetes also, bill will be generated because you need to go for medium instances. Medium instances are chargeable. If you go for EKS also, bill will be generated. Right. So bill is common here. Bill is common here. If you want to run the multi-node cluster, you need to go for Kubernetes. If you go for Kubernetes, process is difficult. Process is difficult. As you are a beginner, you may not be able to understand that setup. So first, let's understand some Kubernetes concepts. In the coming classes, we will see Kubernetes setup also. Initially, I want to go with the EKS cluster. EKS cluster is the easiest way to set up the cluster, and that is the most trusted approach to run the cluster. So Kubernetes, you need for the Kubernetes setup, you need medium instances. They are commercial. The AWS EKS cluster is also commercial. Hourly bill will be generated. Got it? Now here, I will go for EKS cluster. Bill will be generated. We need that cluster for next 10 days or 15 days of time. We need that cluster for 10 days or 15 days of time. If you want to practice Kubernetes, then 100% you need to set up the cluster. Bill will be generated. But I will tell you the solution, how to make that bill amount as 0. So you can go to support center in the AWS cloud. Once your bill got generated, in the support center, there is an option called create case option. You can create a case with the account billing section. Account billing team will be available. You can tell them that, I'm a student, I don't have money to pay the bill amount. I'm learning the AWS cloud. Like this, you can write a message for the AWS support team. So whenever you write that message, whenever you create a case, immediately support team will connect with you in the web chat, then and there itself. And they will check your account. They will see which services you have used, how much bill got generated. Then they will ask you to delete the cluster. They will ask you to delete all the machines you created in the Linux machines or whatever the machines you create in the AWS. Then they will make your bill amount as 0. Sir, how many times we can ask AWS to make bill amount 0? 1 or 2 times maximum. First time they will do for 100%. Second time also they will do, but third time they will not do. So I asked AWS team a couple of times. So first time they have made my bill amount. I got 8,000 bill first time. So they made my bill amount as 0. Second time I got 7,000 bill. They made my bill amount 0. Third time when I ask them, they don't do it. Because already we have given two times chances for you. First time we cleared 8,000 bill. Second time we have given 5,000, 6,000 bill. Third time we don't make the bill amount as 0. So then what will happen? Either I need to pay the bill amount. If I don't pay the bill amount, my account will be blocked. AWS will not do any auto deductions from your card. Whenever you are creating the account in the AWS, you have given your card details, but you don't need to worry about that. AWS people will never deduct the amount from your card directly without your permission. That is guarantee in the AWS, right? Even if bill is generated, first time 10,000 bill generated, they will make it 0. Second time 5,000 bill generated, they will make it 0. Third time they will not make it 0. Either you have to pay the bill amount or else your account will be terminated. Your account will be terminated. If our account is terminated, then what we can do? We will create another account with the another mail ID, another 1 year free access we will get. Got my point? Now here if you observe, 2 of my accounts got blocked because we have not done the payment for that. Bill got generated. 2 times they made it as 0. See here if we go for my previous account, now they will say my account is blocked. Now sign in. If I click on sign in, what happened? Your account is suspended because of the fast due charges. To reactivate your account, open the billing cost management console. If you don't pay the bill amount, to show the people that your account will be blocked, I did not clear my bill in this account. Right? Are you guys getting my point? AWS will give you a couple of reminders. Even after giving the reminders, if you don't do the clearance for your bill, then your account will be suspended. Once account is suspended, then what I have done? I have created another account to take the classes. Now I am using another account. You understand my point? Now I am using another account. With another mail ID, I created account. Now I got 1 more year access. Now I can use this cloud free account for another year. Now in this account, cluster setup I am going to do. First time bill will generate. For that first time bill, we can ask AWS to make it 0. They will do that. Yeah, only with new email ID, you can create it. Yes, guys, are you clear? What setup we are going to do now? Are you clear with what kind of setup we are going to do now? What setup we are going to do now? Kubedium or EKS? EKS. What is the difference between Kubedium and EKS? What is the difference between Kubedium and EKS? Kubedium is a self-managed cluster. We need to take the machines and we need to install everything to set up the cluster. That is difficult process. So that's why we are going for managed cluster. What is the meaning of managed cluster? EKS is a fully managed by AWS. Fully managed by AWS. That is the most recommended approach to run our Kubernetes cluster. In the real time, companies will use EKS cluster only. In the companies, people will use EKS cluster only because it is fully managed by AWS. You don't need to bother about availability of your cluster. Everything will be taken care by EKS. Got it? Now, guys, when we set up this EKS cluster, what will happen is one control plane will be created. This control plane will be completely managed by AWS. One control plane will be created. Okay, I want to create one control plane. For this control plane, I will attach 2 worker nodes. For this control plane, I will attach 2 worker nodes. So this is worker node 1 and this is worker node 2. So this is node 1, worker node 1 and this is worker node 2. Like this, I will attach worker nodes to the control plane. Are you guys clear with my point? Now I want to tell AWS to create the EKS cluster. I need one control plane and I need 2 worker nodes. Now, in order to create this control plane, by using AWS, here I'm going to create one Linux machine. This is called my EKS managed host. Using this Linux machine, I will tell the AWS to create my EKS cluster. Okay, guys. So this is my EKS managed host machine. This is a normal Linux machine I'm going to create. In this Linux machine, I will install kubectl. What I will do? I will install kubectl in this Linux machine. This Linux machine is used to connect with the control plane. Control plane will be connected with the worker nodes. Are you guys getting my point? Master node and control plane both are same. Yes, we don't call it as a master node in the Kubernetes. We will call it as a control plane in the Kubernetes. Now, I want to create EKS cluster. This is my EKS cluster. In this EKS cluster, control plane will be available and worker nodes also will be available. In this EKS cluster, control plane will be available and worker nodes will be available. How to create this control plane and worker nodes? For that, I'm going to take one more machine called EKS managed host. One Linux machine I'm going to take. In this Linux machine, I will install one software called AWS CLI. I will install one software called AWS CLI, and by using that AWS CLI, I will create the cluster. By using AWS CLI, I will create the cluster. Once the cluster is created, to deploy my applications, I need to connect with the cluster. To connect with the cluster, I'm going to use kubectl software I will install in this machine. So this machine I will call as EKS managed host. I'm going to create one virtual machine in the AWS cloud. In that virtual machine, I need to install AWS CLI. AWS CLI is a command line software to create the resources in the AWS cloud through command prompt. So by using this AWS CLI, I'm going to create a EKS cluster. In the EKS cluster, I'm going to tell I need one control plane and I need 2 worker nodes. I will tell to that information to the AWS cloud by using this AWS CLI software. So by using this AWS CLI, I will set up the EKS cluster. Once the EKS cluster setup is completed, I need to communicate with the cluster to run my application. So here in this Linux machine, I will install kubectl. In this Linux machine, I will install the kubectl. By using this kubectl, we need to connect with the control plane to deploy our application. How kubectl will understand where is your control plane? For that, what we need to do is cluster configuration will be available. Cluster configuration file we need to update in the EKS managed host machine. That file is called as kubeconfig file. For every cluster, configuration will be available. What is the URL of the cluster, where the cluster is running, that cluster information we need to keep in our managed host machine. So that file is called kubeconfig file. What is there in the kubeconfig file? Kubeconfig file will contain our cluster information. EKS cluster will be available. EKS cluster information will be available in the kubeconfig file. So now in this machine, I will install the kubectl. By using kubectl, I want to deploy my application. So where is the cluster? This is just one normal Linux machine. In this Linux machine, I install the kubectl. By using kubectl, I want to deploy my application. kubectl should send the request to the control plane. Where is the control plane? Control plane information will be available in the kubeconfig. That is the cluster information. So control plane data will be taken as a kubeconfig data. That kubeconfig data I will configure in the Linux machine so that when I execute the kubectl, this kubectl will understand where is the cluster and it will send the request to the cluster to deploy our application. Then cluster will send the task to the worker nodes. In the worker nodes, our containers will be created inside the pod. Okay. Now, in order to create this cluster, I'm using AWS CLI. So to create the cluster by using this Linux machine, for this machine, we need to attach one IAM role. We need to create one IAM role in the AWS cloud. To create the cluster, some permissions are required. IAM permissions are required. I will create the IAM permissions in the AWS cloud. The IAM role I will attach to this EC2 machine. That IAM role I will attach to this EC2 machine. Finally, as a DevOps engineer, I will go and set up this managed host machine. In this managed host machine, I will attach one IAM role. The role is required to set up the EKS cluster. Some permissions are required for this machine to set up the EKS cluster. Okay. So now what I'm going to do here, first I will create one Linux machine. For that Linux machine, I need to attach one IAM role. I need to create the IAM role and I need to attach that IAM role to this Linux machine. After that process is completed, I need to install the AWS CLI software in that machine. Once I install the AWS CLI, using that AWS CLI, I will create EKS cluster. Once the cluster is created, cluster kubeconfig file I need to update in the Linux machine. After updating the kubeconfig file, I will install the kubectl. Once the kubectl is installed, by using that kubectl, we can connect with the cluster to deploy our applications. Guys, are you clear what we need to do now? Are you clear what we need to do now? Are you clear what we need to do now? So first should I set up the cluster directly, or I need to set up one machine to create the cluster? I need one machine to create the cluster. In the AWS, we need to create one machine. By using that machine, we will set up the cluster. By using that machine, we will deploy our applications in the cluster. That is called managed host, or I can say EKS client machine. Simply, I can tell this as EKS managed host, or I can say it is a EKS client VM. What is the meaning of EKS client VM? This machine is acting as a client to communicate with the EKS cluster. Either I can call EKS managed host or I can say EKS client VM. Now, who will do all these operations in the company? DevOps engineer. DevOps engineer is responsible to do all this setup in the project. In the project, multiple clusters will be available. Dev cluster, SIT cluster, prod cluster, multiple EKS clusters will be available in the project. For the production, separate cluster will be available. For non-production, separate cluster will be available. In one project, multiple EKS clusters will be available. Got it. I'm repeating once again. Guys, observe. I want to set up Kubernetes cluster. Kubernetes cluster we can set up in multiple ways. One is self-managed cluster and the second one is managed cluster. In the self-managed cluster, we have two options. One is Minikube and the second one is Kubedium. Minikube is a single node cluster that is just for practice and learning purpose, which will not be used in the real time. Next one is the Kubedium. Kubedium, nothing but multi-node cluster. We can use the Kubedium cluster, but it is our responsibility. If anything is going down, then we need to take care of it. Kubedium cluster. So to avoid such kind of downtime problems, people will go for Kubernetes managed cluster. Managed cluster, nothing but provider will give the cluster for us. Once we take the cluster from the provider, we will pay the money for the provider. Provider will fully manage that cluster. So always it will be high available. So currently I'm going for EKS cluster. Now I want to set up EKS cluster. In order to set up the EKS cluster, first what I am going to do is I'm going to create one Linux machine as a client machine, guys. First, I need to create one Linux machine as a client machine. In the AWS account, I will create one Linux machine. This Linux machine, let me call it as EKS client VM. I'm going to create one EKS client VM. In this machine, I'm going to install several softwares to create the cluster and to communicate with the cluster. So for this EKS machine, in this EKS machine, I will install AWS CLI software. I will install AWS CLI software. What is the purpose of AWS CLI software? AWS CLI software is used to create the EKS cluster. To create the cluster using AWS CLI from this machine, we need some permissions for that. So in the AWS, to manage the permissions, there is a service called IAM service is available. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. So here, to create the cluster for our machine users, default user will be there, easy to user. For that user, some permissions are required. So that's why whatever the roles are required, I will create the roles by using IAM. That IAM role I will attach to my EKS client machine. I will install AWS CLI to create the cluster. I will install AWS CLI to create the cluster. Along with the AWS CLI, we need some IAM role. I will create the IAM role. I will attach the IAM role to the CLI machine, this client machine. AWS CLI software is installed, IAM role is attached. Now, using this CLI software, I'm going to create cluster. I will tell the CLI to create a cluster. So when I tell the CLI to create the cluster, what this CLI will do? It will create one control plane and it will create two worker nodes. Worker node 1, worker node 2. This worker node 1 and worker node 2 are connected with the control plane. This is my CP, nothing but control plane. And this is my node 1, worker node 1. And this is my worker node 2. So who will create this? By using AWS CLI, I will create this cluster. This is called my EKS cluster. AWS EKS cluster. AWS EKS cluster. So this cluster I am going to create by using this client machine. So by using this client machine, I will tell to AWS to create the cluster. It will be created. Once a cluster is created, how to communicate with the cluster? In order to communicate with the cluster, we can go for either web dashboard or we can go for CLI, right? Cluster will be created, control plane will be available, worker nodes will be available. How to communicate with the cluster? kubectl CLI. That kubectl CLI I will install in my client machine. kubectl software I will install in my client machine. So first I installed AWS CLI that is used to create the cluster. Now to communicate with the cluster, I will go for kubectl. Now, when I install the kubectl software to connect with the cluster, how kubectl will know where is the cluster? Where is the cluster? How many nodes are there in the cluster? What is the cluster URL? So now in this machine, as we are using the kubectl, we need to tell to this machine where is the cluster available. So for that, cluster config file will be available. That cluster config file we will set up in the client machine. That config file is called as kubeconfig file. That config file is called as a kubeconfig file. That kubeconfig file we need to add in our client machine. What will be there in the kubeconfig file? In the kubeconfig file, cluster information will be available. In the kubeconfig file, cluster information will be available. So this is called our EKS cluster with the client machine. This client machine is a Linux machine. Using this client machine, I will create the cluster. Once the cluster is created, now I can send the request to the cluster to deploy my application. So to communicate with the cluster, we are installing the kubectl. Now what I will do, I will work as a DevOps engineer. As a DevOps engineer, I will connect to this client machine and I will deploy my application by using kubectl. What this kubectl will do? kubectl will send the request to the control plane. Control plane will send the request to the worker node. Here the worker nodes are connected to the control plane. Whenever we create the cluster, control plane will be created. That control plane will be connected to the worker nodes. As a DevOps engineer, we will do all these operations. We will create one virtual machine. In that machine, we will install the CLI. We will create a IAM role. That IAM role we will attach to this machine and we will install the AWS CLI. Using that CLI, we will set up the cluster. Once the cluster setup is completed, we will take the kubeconfig file. That kubeconfig file we will update in the client machine. Using that kubeconfig file, kubectl will understand where is the cluster. Now by using kubectl, we can deploy our applications in the cluster. You got the clarity? How to set up EKS cluster? See, EKS cluster setup, you are feeling difficult. If I go for Kubadium, n number of problems will come. Got it, guys? You got the clarity now? How to set up EKS cluster? Same diagram I have taken once again. That's it, to give you more clarity. Docker is easy, Kubernetes is easy. Guys, Docker is easy, Kubernetes is easy. Docker is easy, Kubernetes is interesting. Can we use Minikube for the practice purpose? You can use it, guys, but if you practice with the EKS cluster, then you will get more concept in the industry standard. Because if you learn from Minikube, tomorrow you may not be able to answer the questions in the interview. Okay. Yeah, fine, perfect. So now let us start our cluster setup. Guys, for the cluster setup, I have prepared documentation. It is available in the GitHub. So what is the first step in our setup, guys? What is the first step in our setup? EKS management host. That is nothing but our client machine. EKS management host, nothing but that is our client machine. We need to create EKS management host in the AWS. I have given the steps. Launch a new Ubuntu VM using AWS EC2, T2 micro. This client machine is micro machine only. No need to pay anything for that. It is free of cost. After that, connect to machine and install kubectl using below commands. Directly, I'm telling how to install the kubectl. And you can install the AWS CLI latest version using below commands. So we are using AWS CLI latest version using below commands. So here, these commands are used to install the kubectl. These commands are used to install the CLI. Now, install EKS-CTL using below commands. One more software I missed here. Along with AWS CLI and kubectl, we need to install one more thing, EKS-CTL. EKS-CTL to create the EKS cluster. Okay, so total 3 softwares we need to install in the client machine. One is AWS CLI, another one is kubectl, another one is EKS-CTL. How to install those softwares? I have given the commands also very clearly. So the first step, create EKS management host in the AWS. I'm going to create one Linux machine. In that Linux machine, I will install the AWS CLI, I will install the EKS-CTL, and I will install the kubectl software. Now, once that configuration is done, then we need to go for IAM role creation and attach the IAM role to EKS management host. We need to create the IAM role and attach that to EKS management host. How to do that? So we need to go for AWS IAM service. How we are using AWS EC2 service. Similarly, AWS IAM service will be available. Here we are using EC2, right? Similarly, you can search for a service called IAM service, manage access to AWS resources. So using this IAM service, we need to create one IAM role. Using this IAM service, we need to create one IAM role. When we are creating that IAM role, we need to provide several permissions. Create a new role using IAM service. Now here, there is a concept called roles concept is available. We need to create a new role. Whenever we are creating a new role in the AWS IAM, use case I'm selecting as EC2, then click on next. Here, there are policies are available. We need to create the IAM role with the below policies. IAM full access, VPC full access. I need to select like this. IAM full access. Okay, IAM full access. I will select that. Then clear the filter. Then what is the next one? After IAM full access, I need to provide VPC full access. Amazon VPC full access. This role I have to, this policy I have to select. So now I have said there are 825 policies are available in the AWS. I need to select 5 policies. Then EC2 full access. EC2 full access. Okay, Amazon EC2 full access. Then after Amazon EC2 full access, Cloud Formation full access. Now let's type Cloud Formation full access. Cloud Formation full access. Then clear the filter. I selected 4 policies. Then after administrator access, I'm creating a role For this role, I'm giving all these accesses. Administrator access. Here administrator access is available. So total, I selected 5 policies. Got it. So you need to create a new role using IAM service. For that role, we need to provide all these permissions. Okay. After adding all these things, click on next. Click on next. What is the name you want to give for that? EKS role 1. Something like this, I'm giving that. EKS role 1 and click on create role. You check it. All the policies are added to the role. Administrator access is added. Cloud formation full access. Amazon EC2 full access. Amazon VPC full access and IAM full access. So here I have given what are the permissions we need to give. So whatever the name you want to give for the role, EKS role EC2, something like this. You can give any name for that role. EKS EC2 role, EKS EC2 role 1. Let me give this. EKS EC2 role 1. Name can be anything, guys. Name can be anything. Now, once it is done, we will create the role. So role I am creating by using IAM. This role is not commercial, guys. IAM service is completely free in the AWS. Now I will create this role. So with this, our role will be created. Once this role is created, then what we need to do? We need to attach the created role to the EC2 instance, right? How to attach the role to the EC2 instances? So when we go for EC2 service, our machine will be created. Suppose, for example, we created the machine, we installed all the required softwares. Once we install that, we need to go for actions and we need to go for security, modify IAM role. So we'll create one Linux machine, right? In that Linux machine, we are going to install all these required softwares connected to this machine, and install the kubectl, install the CLI, and install the ekctl. Then for that machine, we need to attach the role we have created. In the IAM, I created a role, right? Now select this machine, which machine we are using as EKS client machine. That machine should have our IAM role. Go to action, security, modify the IAM role. So whatever the IAM role I created, EKS EC2 role 1 I have created, right? We need to update the IAM role. So that is the second step. Okay, guys. Now, first step is creating a machine. Ubuntu machine we are taking. In that machine, we are going to install kubectl, AWS CLI, EKS CTL. Once that process is completed, we need to create the IAM role and attach to EKS management host. So you have seen now how to create a role and how to add the policies for the role and how to attach the role to the EC2 machine. Once that is completed, then finally we will create the cluster by using ekctl. So here, when to create the cluster, this is a single command. EKSCTL create a cluster. Whatever the name you want to give for the cluster, you can give the name region. In the AWS, there is a concept called region. So here, Mumbai region we are operating. You can use either Mumbai region or you can use any region also. It's better to use the nearest region. So for me, the nearest region is a Mumbai. That means I need to go for AP South 1 is my region code. AP South 1 is my region code, right? So if anybody in the US, they can go for their nearest region. Suppose if you go for North Virginia, US East 1 will be the region code. Now here, earlier I created the cluster in the US East 1. Then node type. I need worker nodes. Worker nodes I need as a medium instances. They are also chargeable. Cluster is chargeable. T2 medium instances are chargeable. So now node type I want to T2 medium. In that the nodes should be created in the zones US East 1A, US East 1B. Suppose if you want to create the cluster in the North Virginia region, then you can go for that. US East 1, the zones are US East 1A, US East 1B. Suppose if anybody want to go with the Mumbai region, then your region code will be AP South 1, AP South 1A, AP South 1B. For the people who are creating the cluster in the North Virginia, US East 1 is your region code. Your zones are US East 1A, US East 1B. Now, let me edit this. Suppose here, if you want to create the cluster example, North Virginia region. If anybody want to go with the North Virginia, they can use this. If anybody want to go with the Mumbai, if you want to go with the Mumbai region, don't do both guys. When one is sufficient. If you want to go with the Mumbai region, then your command will be AP South 1. AP South 1. And your zone will be AP South 1A, AP South 1B. AP South 1A, AP South 1B. Right. So this is for North Virginia cluster and this is for the Mumbai region. People who are in US, they can use North Virginia. People who are in India, they can use Mumbai region. So like this, we can create our cluster. Commit the changes. I am modifying in the GitHub, my document. Right. Now, here, create EKS cluster using EKSCTL. EKSCTL software we are installing here, right? Using that we need to do. So this is the syntax for creating the cluster using CLI. If you are using North Virginia region, you need to use your region code and your zones codes. If you are using Mumbai region, then you need to use your region code and your zones. So now, whenever you execute this command, right guys, whenever you execute this command, cluster creation will take 5 to 10 minutes of time. We have to wait. After cluster created, we can check the nodes using below command. Once your cluster, it may take 5 to 10 minutes of time to create the cluster. Once this cluster is created, then you can execute this command kubectl get nodes. When you execute this command kubectl get nodes, it will display the cluster nodes which are attached to the control plane. Once this is completed, then you need to go for EKS cluster config file in the management host. As I told you, so control plane is created, worker nodes are created. Control plane config file we need to update in the kubeconfig. Kubeconfig data updated in the client machine. How to update this? We need to execute the below command in the management host and copy kubeconfig file data cat.kubeconfig. Now, once we have executed that file, we will be getting the sudo mkdir.kube, sudo vi kubeconfig, EKS nodes. With this, our setup will be completed. Kubeconfig file we need to update here. Got it? Kubeconfig file will be created. With that kubeconfig file, our cluster information will be available. Yeah, you remove this what guys, I will explain you how to set up this kubeconfig file data. How can we set up it? Yes, you can. Up to this, I'm removing this. Step 1, management host. Step 2, IAM role. Step 3, creating the cluster. And check that kubectl get nodes. Are we able to get the cluster or not? With this, we are done with our setup. Okay. After practice, delete the cluster and the cluster resources we have used in the cloud to avoid the billing. But for next 10 days, we need the cluster. For next 10 days, we need to practice the Kubernetes concepts, right? For that, we need this cluster. Yeah. So this is my GitHub document. Can you guys try to set up this? Can you guys try to set up this before coming to tomorrow's session? Yeah, you can do it tomorrow. Today you can complete this setup. So in the tomorrow class, I will do this setup. Today I want you people to try this and try to create the cluster. Whenever you execute kubectl get nodes, it will display the nodes information. If nodes are displaying, that means we are done with our setup. After your practice, delete the cluster and other resources we have used in the AWS cloud to avoid the billing. So this step we don't need to do now because we need to practice it for next 10 days. Bill will be generated, no problem. We can make the bill amount as 0. You don't worry about that. Just set up the cluster and learn the concept. Then I will show you how to make the bill amount as 0. So total 4 steps you need to do. Create one machine with Ubuntu flavor, install the softwares, CLI, kubectl, ekctl. Then create the IAM role. I have shown you how to create the IAM role. Attach the IAM role to that machine. Then in that machine, execute the command. If you want to go for North Virginia, this command you need to execute. If you want to go for Mumbai, this command you need to execute. People who are in India, execute Mumbai region command. People who are in the North Virginia, you execute this command. Okay. So it depends upon currently which region you have selected. If you select here Mumbai, then execute the Mumbai region command. By default for the Indian people, Mumbai will open here. For North Virginia people, that US will be open. Either you can go for Ohio, California, or Oregon. So here the region codes will be available. For North Virginia, region code is US East 1. For Mumbai, the region code is AP South 1. Okay. So in which region you are creating the resources, based on that you need to execute that command. Once you execute this command, cluster creation will take 5 to 10 minutes of time. We have to wait. After cluster created, we can check the nodes, kubectl get nodes. If you are able to execute this command, if you are able to see the nodes information, then we are good. Then we can start practicing our Kubernetes. Guys, once again, I'm telling you, Kubernetes is a difficult subject. Without practicing, you will not understand anything. So please set up the cluster and please practice the concepts on daily basis, whatever we are discussing. You cannot stop the cluster once you create, guys. So cluster you can't stop. The only option is you have to delete the cluster. You can't stop the cluster after your practice is completed. Once our Kubernetes topics are completed, then we are going to delete the cluster. Once the cluster is created, you cannot stop it. You have to delete it. You have to delete it. You can't stop it. Okay. Yeah. Anybody having any questions? So could you please ask your questions?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Tell me.
Sir, can we not automate this? So instead of keeping it up and running for 10 days, we automate.
You can't stop it, sir. You have to delete it.
I know. We will delete it. I'm saying all this cluster creation, if we can use some...
You can automate it by using Terraform, but as of now, Terraform is not covered in our classes. No? Okay, Terraform is our future topic. People don't know Terraform now. By using Terraform, we can automate.
And then create this cluster only when we need it and just practice and then destroy it.
Yes, you can do that.
Okay.
Ashok, there is one question. Can I use my local laptop as for the EKS client machine if the kubectl and AWS client is already installed?
Yes,
instead of SQL? Yeah,
you can use it, but here, whatever the client machine that we are using, that is micro machine only, free of cost only, no problem.
Okay, I got it. Yeah.
Hello, sir. In the EKS cluster, only the worker node count will be 2 only, or we can increase or decrease?
You can increase that count also, sir. By default, here if you see, we are giving the nodes minimum 2, maximum 2 like this, right? Here in this command, I am not giving the node count. If I don't give the node count, by default it will take 2. If you want the node count, if you give this option, nodes minimum 5, then 5 nodes also will come. These are the medium instances, charges will apply. That's why I'm going with only 2 nodes.
Okay, and control panel will be a single one, right?
Control plane will be only one, but AWS will manage that. It will not be down at any time. Okay. We don't know how exactly they are managing. What is their background process? We don't know. Control plane will manage by AWS cloud. It will not go down.
Thank you.
Hello, sir. Hello.
Yeah. Hi.
Can you go for the first picture? You showed me that one.
1 minute.
Uh, Yes, here actually that created EKS cluster, so that the client machine we are creating Ubuntu either one actually 20.4. So the control panel, the EKS cluster we are creating the control panel one machine, then actually another actually worker node one machine and worker node two machines. So if you have to
Yeah,
create
you no
three
need
machines.
no need to create these machines, right?
Okay.
Whenever you execute this command, the control plane machine worker nodes will be created by the AWS. You know, if you execute this command, right? Control plane worker nodes, this process, whichever I have circled, will be created automatically.
Does it create a one machine or multiple machines?
Multiple machines, right?
Okay. We can create actually, we can give the count number into the AWS.
Yes, here I have given the count, min2.
Okay.
That is a
Okay.
syntax.
Okay. So
if you don't
then
give the count, the default count will be 2.
default. This we can actually suppose we are giving two machines. One
Control plane is common. The count is only for the nodes, worker nodes. Control plane will be only one. Whatever the count that we are giving, that count is applicable for only worker nodes. Okay, guys, good. Yeah. Anyone else having any other questions?
Hello, sir.
Yep.
Sir, actually, I want to know the basic difference which you are installing kubectl and that other one. Like, what is the usage? It is creating the cluster. Which one? EKSCTL.
EKSCTL is a utility to create the EKS cluster. Okay. To run this to run the EKSCTL command, we need AWS CLI software. kubectl is used to communicate with the cluster for our deployments.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Can you give the note actually that in the diagram? Can you give the note for that one?
Yeah, sure, sir. I will add.
No. What I'm asking is, can you take? Okay, kubectl is actually kubectl is a communicator that EKSCTL is
used to create the cluster.
a cluster. Okay, give me that. If it is any hint note, actually, you see for us. Okay.
So in your notes, like the command in GitHub, you are mentioning to create those worker node using like T2 medium. But do we need to specify what should be the node type for the?
We need to specify the
plain.
Yeah.
For the.
No, if you go for T2 micro, right? Your high availability and that speed will not be available. Resources will not be sufficient. That's why I'm going with medium instances. Micro is not recommended. Because
what I'm saying, this medium is for the worker node, right?
Correct.
Where do we specify what kind of machine our control plane is running?
No. For control plane, we are not specifying any machine. It is a fully managed service by AWS. AWS will take care
so
of
this is not like a EC2 box. It's not going to be EC2 box. Okay.
It's not a EC2 box. Worker nodes are the EC2 boxes. Control plane is not a EC2 box. It is a service in the AWS. What background, how many machines they are running the control plane, we don't know that.
Okay.
Or we can make it less also.
So the last class you mentioned actually that Go language. Does it require to learn the Go language?
No. It is developed by using Go, but we don't need to know that Go language.
So Python is good for that one, or that Java?
You don't need any language to work with the Kubernetes. To work with the Kubernetes, you need YML. That YML I will explain.
YAML, okay.
Ashok, worker node can be less, or we can select, or only 2 is required.
One also you can select, but recommended to go with the 2. When you go for 1, right, high availability will not be there. Again.
Yeah, for learning purpose, we can use it, right?
Yeah, we can use it.
Ashok, can you please show this diagram as well?
But I suggest you to go with the 2 so that you will get more clarity.
Yes. Yesterday you have to take in the last class. So that the real-time scenario actually that that 100,000 machine actually requirement. So we need actually that one control plain, and also 2 worker node is fine. So if more than that requirement comes, actually we have to go increase that depend upon the increase scalabilities, correct?
Correct.
Okay,
Kubernetes will do that. Kubernetes will do that scaling. We'll discuss in the class.
Okay.
Ashok, one more thing. You told like you created one PPT for Docker, multiple
I will share
commands,
Yeah,
right?
yes. I already gave those commands in the notes also. In the
Okay.
notes, if you see the Docker summary, at
Okay.
the end, I have given all the commands.
So all are there. Okay.
Yep,
Thank
all
you.
are there.
Sir, in AWS, instances is given by user or it's automated by AWS itself?
Instances means?
Number
What
of
is your number of instances
yes, sir.
in the cluster?
Yes.
Yeah, if you don't give that, it will take by default to 2. If you want more than that, you can give that.
How do we know what is the requirement?
That project will decide, sir. Architect team will decide that how many instances we need to use, how many worker nodes we need to use. That will be decided in the project, right? You will get that information. They will give you the requirement.
Thank you.
So, sir, from our side, we are just creating the EC2 VM and we are running the commands inside that to create the cluster.
Yes,
right?
correct. The remaining part will be taken care by AWS to do that.
Okay.
Ashok, as you said that, and this is the responsibility of DevOps engineer in the organization to create this cluster setup, all those things. So currently, you are sharing the steps in the GitHub account. You are sharing the steps to create the cluster. But in the organization, once we go, then how we can? How do we need to memorize
in the company? For every project, documentation will be available. Which softwares we need to set up, how to set up, so that scripts will be available for that. And here in the AWS, I'm creating the EKS cluster, right? It is one resource. In the real time, we don't create anything manually. Everything will be automated by using Terraform.
Okay.
Got it? Yeah.
Here
we are learning the concept manually to create the cluster. But in the real time, nobody will create the infrastructure manually. Everything will be automated in the real time by using Terraform.
Okay. And what scripting language is used in Terraform, sir?
That is HCL, sir. It's HCL. That is Terraform own language.
Okay.
Ashok, one more thing, please. Can you please share the paint file as well, the diagram you explained?
Yeah, sure.
It may be too early to ask this, but Ashok sir, once we create this cluster with the 2 node, can we add and remove node later on with the this
yes.
EKS CTL commands? Okay.
You can remove the node. If you remove the node, automatically it will add one more node. When we are giving the cluster, we are giving the node count as 2, right? When we give the 2 as a node count, Kubernetes cluster will always maintain the 2 nodes. If you delete one node, automatically it will replace with the another node. 2 will be available always.
So when you are deleting the node, the automatically will create
one more node will spin up.
Okay, no need to stop the container, is correct?
No.
Okay.
No.
So one more question actually, because actually this is too early. I don't know. So that workflow from that top to bottom, some cycle in the DevOps actually, because I saw that the tools which is Bitbucket and SonarQube, Maven and Ansible, Terraform, and Docker and Kubernetes. How does we say actually when we are?
We once the course is completed, we will have the interview preparation, mock interview will be there. I will give that complete clarity.
Okay. And one more thing actually, because actually that you already mentioned that in the the microservices core classes, and also the taking the real-time scenario of the AWS and how to attend the interview. It comes under that the Java class, or I have to take that separate class for that one?
The project development part will comes under Java project course. DevOps project will come in this course only. Complete AWS and DevOps concepts will be covered in this course.
So if you want, I can join that other one also.
Yes,
correct?
Right.
Okay. Because actually it's because they're taking a little later, because my time is actually at 11 o'clock. Okay. Yeah.
Fine, guys. Good. With this, I'm stopping for now. I have updated the notes in the portal, and I have given the Git repository URL also for that cluster setup. So please practice the cluster setup. Try to complete it by today. In the tomorrow session, I will complete the cluster set.
The
Sir.
EKS client and EKS cluster will run in a different server, virtual machine.
Sorry, can you come again?
EKS client, EKS cluster run in different machines.
Right, sir. Client machine is one machine, control plane is different, and worker nodes are different.
Yeah, the cluster, what we created, the different.
Yes, right.
Okay.
Sir,
Creation it will not be done using debit card.
Sorry, sir.
AWS creation, AWS account creation.
You can do that. Account creation you can do by using debit card, or you can do it by using credit card also.
Okay.
Yeah, sir. I have enrolled for this Docker, Jenkins, and Kubernetes course. So will we be doing that project in this course also?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Sir, how many projects? Like
1 or 2 projects I will show you with the Jenkins Docker Kubernetes integration.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. With this, I'm stopping for now. We'll meet in the tomorrow session.